Talking about freedom here, not price. So think of free speech, not free beer. And then you'll understand the term free software correctly. When software is not free, it is proprietary software, user subjugating software. Proprietary software is distributed in a way that keeps the users divided and helpless. The difference between free software and proprietary software is not a technical question. It's not a matter of what's in the code of the program. It's a matter of whether the distribution of the program respects your freedom or not. Proprietary software keeps the users divided because every user is forbidden to share with anybody else. And proprietary software keeps the users helpless because the users don't have the source code, so they can't change the software. They can't even verify independently what it's doing. All they can do is take it on blind faith from companies, many of which clearly do not deserve any kind of trust. But free software respects the user's freedom. What does that mean? We have to be more specific. Free software means that you have 4 essential freedoms. Freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program as you wish. Freedom 1 is the freedom to study the source code and change it so that the program does what you wish. Freedom 2 is the freedom to help your neighbor. That's the freedom to distribute copies of the program to others when you wish, up to and including republication of the program, if you wish. And freedom 3 is the freedom to help build your community. That is the freedom to distribute copies of your modified versions when you wish, up to and including publication, if you wish. If the program comes with all 4 of these freedoms, then it's free software. If one of these freedoms is substantially missing, then it is proprietary software. But why are these 4 freedoms essential? Why define free software this way? Freedom number 2, the freedom to help your neighbor, is essential on basic moral grounds, so that you can live an upright life as a good member of your community. If you use a non-free program that doesn't give you freedom number 2, then you're in danger of falling at any moment into a moral dilemma. Whenever your friend says, "That program is nice, could I have a copy?" At that moment, you will face a choice between 2 evils. One evil is to give your friend a copy and violate the license of the program. The other evil is to deny your friend a copy and comply with the license of the program. Being in this dilemma, you should choose the lesser evil, which is to give your friend a copy and violate the license of the program. This evil is the lesser evil because we can assume that your friend is a good, helpful person and deserves your cooperation. We can assume this because, not because it's the only possibility, but because the other case is an easy one. If the person who asks you is not really a decent person, not a good friend, it's simple. You just say, "Why should I do a favor for you?" So that case is easy, but there is also the case where it is a good friend, a decent person, a good member of your community, someone that normally you would help. So that's the case that gives you the dilemma, the case we can't ignore. Whereas the developer of this proprietary program has deliberately attacked the social solidarity of your community. So if you can't help doing some kind of wrong to somebody, better pick the wrong that falls on somebody who's done something wrong to your community, rather than on somebody who hasn't. However, being the lesser evil does not mean it is good. It's never a good thing to make an agreement and then break it. Some agreements are inherently evil, and breaking them is a lesser evil than keeping them. That's the case here. But it's not good. Not really good. And if you do give your friend a copy, what will he have? He'll have an unauthorized copy of a proprietary program. And that's a pretty bad thing. It's almost as bad as an authorized copy of the same program. The only real difference is that the unauthorized copy may avoid directly rewarding the perpetrator of the scheme. That's a small improvement, yes, but not enough to make it a good thing. So, what you should really do, once you understand this dilemma, is make sure you never are in it. There are two ways to do that, both of which require advanced planning. One way is, don't have any friends. That's the method recommended by the proprietary software developers. The other method is, don't use proprietary software. If you don't have a copy of that non-free program, you don't have to worry about what you'll do if your friend asks for a copy of it. That's my solution. If someone offers me a program on the condition I promise not to share it with you, I will say no. I will reject it as a matter of conscience, because accepting it would be a betrayal of my whole community, of my whole world. The most essential resource of any society is not a physical resource, it's a psychosocial resource. It's the spirit of goodwill, the spirit of helping your neighbor. It's no accident that humanity's ethical leaders for thousands of years have tried to promote the spirit of goodwill and benevolence, because they realize that if anybody listens to them, if they can increase the level of the spirit of goodwill even a little bit, they can make life better for everyone. So what does it mean when powerful social institutions say that it's wrong to share with your neighbor? What are they doing? They are poisoning this spirit of goodwill, something that no society can afford. There's no society that has too much spirit of goodwill. And what does it mean when they say that if you share with your neighbor, you're a pirate? What are they really saying when they use that term? They're trying to equate helping your neighbor with attacking ships. And nothing, ethically speaking, could be more wrong than that, because attacking ships is very, very bad. But helping your neighbor is admirable. And what does it mean when they impose harsh punishments, like years in prison, for sharing with your neighbor? How much fear is it going to take before your neighbors are too scared to share with you, or before you are too scared to share with them? I hope you don't want this terror campaign to be operating in your community. And I use the term terror campaign not just as bombast, but for a specific reason. In 2 countries already, the proprietary software developers have threatened the public with rape for using unauthorized copies of non-free software. And when they start threatening people with rape, that's a terror campaign. drill is really craving warm liquid, but it's too hot still. So that's the reason for freedom number 2, the freedom to help your neighbor, the freedom to distribute copies of the program to others when you wish. Freedom 0, the freedom to run the program as you wish, is essential for a different reason. So you can have control of your own computing. There are proprietary programs that don't even give you this much freedom, that restrict how many people can run the authorized copy, or who can run it, or how much, or when, or where, or for what purpose. And this is obviously not having control of your own computing. So freedom 0 is essential. But it's not enough, because freedom 0 just means you can decide to do or not do whatever the developer decided and imposed on you by writing the program. So you need, in order to have control of your own computing, you need freedom 1 as well. The freedom to study the source code and change it so it does what you want. This way, you have control instead of the developers controlling you. If you don't have freedom 1, you can't even tell what the program is doing. And many non-free programs have malicious features, not designed to serve the user, but rather to spy on the user, restrict the user, or even attack the user. For instance, spyware is quite common. One non-free program that you might have heard of that spies on the user is called Microsoft Windows. When the user of Microsoft Windows, and I wouldn't say you because I'm sure you wouldn't use a program like this, when the user of Microsoft Windows uses a system feature to search her own files for a word, Windows sends a message saying what word was searched for. That's one spy feature. But there's another. When Windows XP asks for an upgrade, it sends Microsoft a message with a list of all the programs that are installed on the machine. That's another spy feature. Now, Microsoft did not tell the public about these spy features. People had to figure them out, and since they didn't have the source code, it wasn't easy. But don't think that spying on the user is unique to Windows, because Windows Media Player spies on the user too. In fact, it does total surveillance, reporting, I'm told, everything that the user looks at. But please don't think that this is because Microsoft is uniquely evil. Microsoft is just the biggest of the developers of proprietary user-subjugating software, and Real Player does the same kind of surveillance, and I think did it first. Microsoft then imitated it. Real Player. The TiVo also spies on the user. The TiVo is an interesting case. The TiVo was applauded by many in the free software community when it came out because it uses a lot of free software. In fact, it contains a small GNU plus Linux operating system. But it also contains non-free software, which spies on the user. Now, I think the people who applauded were making a mistake. You know, everyone's welcome to use our software, but when they use our software, they should be thanking us, not we them. The time we should thank them is when they contribute, not when they benefit. So I think those people had it a bit backwards. But nonetheless, the important thing about the TiVo is it shows us that the goal of convincing people to, quote, use free software, unquote, is too weak. Because implicitly that means using some free software. And using some free software is not enough to ensure your freedom. If you want to be free, you have to not use proprietary software, not use any program that would trample your freedom. If you use one, your freedom has been trampled. So the TiVo just gets part of the way there. The goal has to be not to use free software, but rather to stop using proprietary software, to escape. But malicious features get worse than just spying. There's also the functionality of refusing to function. And I'm not talking about bugs here. I'm talking about the program that says to you, I don't want to show you this file. I don't want to let you copy a part of this file. I'm not going to print this file for you because I don't like you. This is also known as digital restrictions management, or DRM. The intentional functionality of refusing to function for you, which really shows you who has control of your computer. And then there are backdoors, malicious functionalities for attacking the user. There was a proprietary program called Interbase, which was liberated by its developers. And when the users could see the source code, they saw it had a backdoor. And probably it had that backdoor for years. But while the program was proprietary, the users couldn't tell. They didn't know they were in danger, but they were. Of course, once it was free software, the users corrected that, because they could. But when it was proprietary software, they would have had difficulty correcting it. Another non-free program that you might have heard of that contains a backdoor is called Microsoft Windows. You see, when Windows asks for an upgrade, Microsoft more or less knows the user's identity. So Microsoft can deliver to that user an upgrade designed specifically for him, which means Microsoft can simply take control of that person's computer, and the user essentially has no recourse. That's the backdoor we know of because its existence can be deduced from the known facts. Are there others? In India, I was told that they had arrested some programmers working on developing Windows XP and accused them of working also for Al-Qaeda, introducing another backdoor that Microsoft was not supposed to know about. This attempt apparently failed. Was there another that succeeded? We can't check, because the source code of Windows is secret. However, Al-Qaeda is not the only malicious, murderous organization that might seek to put malicious features into software. In 1999, Microsoft was caught having installed a backdoor on behalf of the National Security Agency, which works for a government that has caused the death of a lot more people than Al-Qaeda. So, and even in recent years. So, you can't trust non-free software, but paradoxically, non-free software demands total trust, blind faith from the user. Blind because you can't see, you can't check, you can't tell anything. So all you can do is give blind faith, even though we know many of the developers contradict that faith that they asked for. And when they're exposed, they say, trust us anyway. Proprietary software is just trust me software. I've shafted you over and over, but trust me not to do it anymore. Of course, that's not true of all of them. There are proprietary software developers that don't put in malicious features. We can't generally tell which ones they are. You know, the only way you can tell whether a proprietary program has a malicious feature is if you know of one. Otherwise, you just don't know. but they exist. However, they're human, so they make mistakes. They design features people don't like. They introduce bugs when they're writing the code. And the user of a program without freedom number one is just as helpless facing an accidental bug as she is facing a deliberate malicious feature. If you use a program without freedom one, you are a prisoner of your software. We, the developers of free software, are human too. We also make mistakes. We design features you don't like. We introduce bugs in the code. It's impossible to avoid it. Every non-trivial program has bugs. The difference is that we don't keep you prisoner of the errors in our code. Whatever features or code you don't like, you're free to change. We can't be superhuman, but we can respect your freedom, and that's the difference. However, freedom one is not enough. Freedom one for an individual is the freedom to personally study and change the source code of the program. This is not enough because there are millions of computer users that don't know how to program, so they can't directly exercise freedom number one. But even for us programmers, it's not enough, because there's just too much software. There's too much free software for any one person to study all the source code and master it and personally make all the changes that she might want. The only way we can fully take control of the software we use is to do it working together, cooperating. And for this, we need freedom 3, which is the freedom to help build your community, the freedom to distribute copies of your modified versions. With this freedom, we all get the benefit of whatever improvements programmers make and then choose to distribute. So suppose there are 1 million users of some free program that want a particular change. Here's how they can get the benefit of the 4 freedoms. By chance, there will be a few thousand of them that know how to program. Someday, a few of them will make this change and publish their modified version. And then all those 1 million people, when they see it, they can install it. They don't have to know how to program to choose that version because they hear from everybody else that it does what they want. So all the users that wanted this change, including the ones that couldn't have written it themselves, and including the ones that could have but they were too busy doing something else, they get the benefit of it. All users get the benefit of the 4 freedoms. Every user can directly exercise freedom 0 and 2. Freedom 0, the freedom to run the program as you wish. Freedom 2, the freedom to distribute copies. You don't have to know how to program to do those things. Freedoms 1 and 3 involve programming. So any given person can exercise them only to the extent he knows how to program, which could be more or less. Of course, any intelligent person can learn some programming, just as any intelligent person can learn some auto maintenance. So as to fix your own car, you don't have to learn enough to be a professional mechanic, and millions of people do. Likewise, millions of people can learn some programming once we stop trying to discourage them, once we get rid of the priesthood of technology that tries to keep this knowledge out of your hands. But most people won't want or won't be able to learn to be really good programmers. That's okay. They can't directly exercise freedoms 1 and 3 to a deep extent. But when some people do exercise them, distributing their modified versions, everybody else gets to run them and make use of the changes they've made. And the result is democracy as well as freedom. Proprietary software develops under the control of its developer. The developer decides what to make it do and what to make it refuse to do, and the users can either accept that or escape. But with free software, nobody has power over anybody else. The users decide what the software will do. The users decide which directions progress will go in. If there is a free program and a lot of users want progress in this direction, they'll make frequent changes, various different people in this direction, and it will make progress. If hardly anybody, but only a few people want progress in this direction, it'll probably make slow progress in this direction. And if nobody wants this direction, it won't go there, because nobody can force that on you. Whereas with proprietary software, the developers can impose malicious features on the users. What if there are just 1,000 users who want a certain change in a free program, and suppose none of them knows how to program? They can still take advantage of the 4 freedoms to get the change they want. Here's one way. One of them can post an announcement saying, does anybody else want this? So they'll get in touch with each other. And then they can start an organization. The idea is that they'll all join and pay dues, and that way the organization will have money to hire programmers to make the change. So if it's a fairly small change and needs a medium-sized change, you need somebody to work for a month, maybe they need $10,000. So they can ask everybody to join and pay $10. Or suppose it's a big change and they need 2 people to work for a year. Well, they might need $100,000, so they'd ask everybody to pay $100,000. Sorry, pay $100. And then they'll have $100,000, which they could hire 2 people for a year with in our community. So, of course, to hire somebody, they'll have to decide who. So they'll have to talk to some programmers. They'll talk to one group of programmers and say, could you do this work? When could you do it? What would you charge? Let's see your portfolio so we can see how good you are. And then they might ask a different group of programmers the same questions, and another group, and then decide. And this shows us something very interesting, that free software carries with it a free market for all types of support and service. By contrast, support for proprietary software is typically a monopoly. Only the developer has the source code, so only the developer can make any change. If a user wants a change, the user has to beg, oh, almighty developer, please make this change for me. Sometimes the developer says, pay us and we'll listen to your problem. If the user does that, the developer says, thank you. In 6 months there will be an upgrade. Buy the upgrade and you'll see if we solved your problem, and you'll see what new problems we have in store for you. But with free software, anybody who has a copy can study the source code, master it, and begin offering support. So we have a free market for support. Therefore, all those businesses and organizations that say that good support is really essential for them, and say that they believe in the free market, most of them are worshipers of the invisible hand, they should be demanding free software, right? Strangely, they're not. You have to wonder what part of what they say doesn't match what they really believe. Interestingly, many people who don't like free software say it's communism. Now, it does have something in common with communism, namely the idea of goodwill towards other people, which is, however, a lot older than communism. But interestingly, in some ways it's quite capitalist. For instance, in the free software movement, we respect your private property. Proprietary software developers mostly don't. They say that, quote, your, unquote, copy of a proprietary program isn't your property. They say it's their property. When you get a copy of a free program, it is your property. And you're free to do all the useful and legitimate things with it. So their attitude towards private property is, it's great as long as it all belongs to us. And they develop things in a command system. And they're developed so as, in many cases, to spy on you and restrict you. So, which one resembles a communist state? Now, this free market for support leads us to a paradox. Usually, when there's a choice of products to do a certain job, we say that there's no monopoly. But when there's a choice of proprietary software products to do a job, yes, there is monopoly. Because if the user chooses this proprietary software product, afterward, she falls into this monopoly for support. But if she chooses this proprietary program, afterwards she's stuck in this monopoly for support. So it's a choice between monopolies. But the only way to escape from monopoly is to escape from proprietary software. And that is the goal of the free software movement. We want to help everybody escape from proprietary software, escape to the free world. Now this leads to a broader principle, an important principle, about the nature of freedom. Freedom is something much bigger than having a choice between a few fixed options. Freedom means having control of your own life. So when anyone tries to analyze the meaning of freedom and starts by equating it to, quote, freedom of choice, unquote, that person has already narrowed it down to those cases where you just have a few fixed options, implicitly, which means he's thrown away most of what freedom means. Having thrown most of it away and kept just a little piece, he will find it quite easy to prove to you that it's not really that important after all. And now you can recognize the fallacy at the beginning of those arguments. So, to have a choice between proprietary programs means being able to choose your master. Freedom means not having a master. And in the area of computing, freedom requires not using proprietary software. Freedom means escaping from proprietary software. And that is the goal of the free software movement. Since its beginning in 1983, that has been our goal. And in order to make this possible, we have built a new continent in cyberspace. It's impossible to be free in the old world of cyberspace, where every program has its lord, and all the users are under the power and dominion of that lord. So we built a new continent, a continent of freedom. And because it's a virtual continent, it has room for everyone. And because we built it, we didn't have to steal it from any indigenous peoples. And it's legitimately there for everyone. Please come join us in the free world. Come join us in freedom. So how did we build this continent? What practically speaking did we have to do? I reached these ideas, basically, not in their current, clearer form, in 1983. And I decided I wanted to use computers and live in freedom. But that was impossible. The computer won't do anything without an operating system. It's useless, dead weight. And all the operating systems for modern computers in 1983 were proprietary, which meant that the second thing you had to do in starting to use a computer after getting the computer was to sign a promise not to share the operating system with anybody else. And all you got was the executable. The source code was essentially unavailable to ordinary users, which meant you had to start with a betrayal. In effect, you had to betray the whole world. So what can I do about this? Well, being just one man with few supporters and no experience in political campaigning, I didn't think I'd have much chance convincing governments to change their laws or convincing companies to change their policies. So I thought of another way to solve the problem, one that involved doing technical work. I realized that if I developed another operating system, I could make it free software, being the author. I wouldn't have to get any laws changed. I would just have to say, you're all free to share this and change this. And if there were another operating system that people could use in freedom, they wouldn't have to use the proprietary ones. They could escape. So I realized I could solve this social problem by doing work of a technical nature, operating system development, which happened to be my field anyway. That's what I had been doing for 13 years. When I realized this, I saw that I was cognizant of a growing social problem that most people did not recognize as a problem. And I had the skills necessary to try to solve it, and that probably no one else could do so if I did not. That meant I had been elected by circumstances to do this job. It's as if you see someone drowning, and you know how to swim, and there's no one else around, and it's not Bush, then you have a moral duty to save that person. Now, that statement is too strong. You don't have to save Cheney either. Or Rice, or Torture Gonzalez, or any of those other people who hate our freedoms. So, I don't know how to swim, but in this case, the job that needed doing was not swimming, it was developing software, and that I know how to do. So, I decided I would develop a free software operating system or die trying. Of old age, presumably. Because back then, the free software movement had no active enemies. There were lots of people who disagreed, but they hardly paid us any attention. They just said, oh, you'll never get anywhere. So the big obstacle was not opposition, it was simply that an operating system is a lot of programs, some of them rather big and complex programs, that we would have to develop all of in order to have a completely free operating system, such as Ubuntu is not. And almost doesn't count. You know, if only one program in the operating system is non-free, that's close but no cigar. Of course, maybe you can replace that one remaining one. Maybe it won't take you that much work to reach the goal, but it isn't at the goal, because there's still something in there that tramples the user's freedom. Nobody knew in 1983, when I announced this project, whether we would ever succeed in producing a free operating system. But when you're campaigning for freedom, you can't wait. until victory is in sight before you start, because then you'll miss most of the opportunities where you might be able to win. You have to start the campaign before you know whether you'll win. So, that's what I decided. That decision led me to other decisions, technical design decisions. What kind of system should it be? Well, back in the 80s, there were various popular computer architectures, and new ones were being developed every year or two. I realized it would take years to develop an entire operating system, and I didn't know what kinds of machines would be popular when we were done. So in order to avoid having the system be obsolete before it was finished, it had to be portable. But there was just one successful portable operating system I knew of, and that was Unix. So I decided to follow the design of Unix. Furthermore, there were a lot of users of Unix. That's another way of saying it was popular, and successful. So that meant if I made it compatible with Unix, a lot of people could easily switch. So I decided to make the system upward compatible with Unix. That is to say, the methods of use that people knew from Unix would work on this system also. But we could add any other features we could think of. We didn't have to let Unix hold us back, but we should make sure that the techniques of use that work on Unix would work on our system as well. I say our system because although it was I who decided this, my first decision actually was I would recruit other people to help so that we'd get it done faster. So, this decision to be compatible, upward compatible with Unix had an interesting consequence. You see, the design of Unix is that it consists of hundreds back then of different components that communicate with each other using more or less documented interfaces. And the users use the same interfaces to talk to these components, which means that to be compatible, you have to keep the interfaces the same and replace each component compatibly, which meant that the initial design decisions were already made. How handy. So the only thing needed in order to start work was a name. Now, in the community of programmers who shared software that I belonged to in the 1970s, the main motive for our work was fascination with programming. Now, it's true that some of us were employees and the rest were mostly students, but that was all secondary. It was the fascination, the joy, that was our main motivation. And the term that we used for ourselves was hackers, which means people who enjoy playful cleverness and look for opportunities to practice it. And this is not just limited to computers. For instance, there are traditions of hacking the buildings at MIT. You know, for instance, putting peculiar, surprising objects on top of the Great Dome is an old tradition of hacking. It's a kind of humor. When someone does a hack like that, people see it and they laugh, and that's the goal. So they put things like a house, a campus police car, a telephone, which was actually wired up to the campus phone exchange, so that when the police got there, the phone rang. A nipple, a statue of a cow, all sorts of things have been put on top of the Great Dome. And the oldest hacker I know of was named Guillaume de Machaut, and he lived in the 1300s. He was Europe's first star composer, and he wrote a piece of music that's a palindrome. Its name is translates as "My end is my beginning," and it actually sounds good too. So you can hack in any domain. But a lot of people hack with computers because they lend themselves to it. So when we developed software, we often gave our programs funny, even mischievous names. And we had a specific custom that we followed in the case where someone developed a program similar to some existing program, which was normal practice in programming back then because programs were not portable. If you saw a nice program that ran on some other system and you wanted features like that on your computer, what you had to do was write it yourself. Again, in a language that would run on your computer. Well, that was normal in all of the field, but when we did this, we would give our new program a name that was a recursive acronym saying this program is not the other one. It's a humorous way of giving the other program credit. So, for instance, in 1975, I developed the first Emacs text editor, an extensible programmable text editor, and there were about 30 imitations of Emacs. Some were called thus and so Emacs, you know, the obvious, not very clever thing. But there was also fine for fine is not Emacs, and sign for sign is not Emacs, and INA for INA is not Emacs, and mince for mince is not complete Emacs. And version 2 of INA was called SVI for SVI was INA initially. So you can have lots of fun with recursive acronyms. I looked for a recursive acronym for something is not Unix, but I couldn't see one that had any other meaning in that form. And if it doesn't have another meaning, it's not funny. So what was I going to do? You know, it's no use using a recursive acronym if it isn't a joke. So I thought, well, I could make a contraction and get rid of the I, and then I could get a 3-letter recursive acronym, blank NU. So I started filling in the blank in different ways. Anu, GNU, KNU, TNU, INU, FNU, GNU. Well, GNU is the funniest word in the English language, used for lots of wordplay, because according to the dictionary, it's pronounced new. So anytime you were going to say that something is new, you could write a GNU and you've got a joke. Maybe not a very good joke, but there are lots of them. And sometimes it is a good joke. For instance, there was a funny song growing out of the word GNU when I was a child. So, with so much humor in that word, given a specific, meaningful reason to choose that name for a particular project, I could not resist. And this shows the hacker spirit, playful cleverness. Here I was, starting the most important work I expected I'd ever do in my life, if it were successful. But that didn't mean I couldn't give it a name, which was a joke. Ha ha, only serious is the essence of the hacker aesthetic. Now, when it's the name of our operating system, please do not follow the dictionary. If you talk about the new operating system, you'll get people rather confused, especially since we've been working on it for 23 years now, so it's not new anymore. But it still is GNU, and it always will be GNU, no matter how many people pronounce it Linux by mistake. So please pronounce a hard G. Well, why did so many people start calling it Linux, even though that's a mistake? Well, that's a matter of the history of the system. See, during the 1980s, we were developing one piece after another, and by 1990, we had just about all of it. One important component was still missing, that being the kernel, which is the program that allocates the machine's resources to all the other programs that you run. So we started developing a kernel, but our kernel project didn't work. In fact, it still doesn't really work well enough to recommend it. But fortunately, we didn't have to wait for that, because in 1991, a college student developed his own kernel, which he released under the name Linux. Linux initially was not free software. The license of the first release of Linux in 1991 had a restriction that made it non-free. However, in 1992, Mr. Torvalds changed the license, adopting the GNU General Public License, which is the license I have written to use on the components of GNU. Well, that's one of the free software licenses. There are many free software licenses. So once he had adopted that GNU GPL as the license for Linux, Linux was free software also. So the combination of the not quite complete GNU system and Linux, the kernel, made a complete system. And for the first time, you could actually get a PC and run it in freedom with no non-free software installed in your machine. And thus, the development of Linux, the kernel, was the final step that crossed the finish line and achieved the goal that we had set forth almost a decade earlier. The development of Linux was an important contribution to our community. However, the mistake of calling the entire system Linux, even though it was much more GNU than Linux, was a major blow to the free software movement, because it led people to think, erroneously, that the system as a whole was mainly Mr. Torvalds' work. Now that might not have mattered except to my ego, except for one other fact, which was that Torvalds doesn't agree with the philosophy of the free software movement and never did. He isn't campaigning for users' freedom, and he says he doesn't really care about it. Well, he has a right to his views. I always acknowledge that, unlike tyrants such as Bush. So, I wouldn't challenge his right to hold those views, but I do object when people attribute the GNU Project's work to him, and when our work, instead of acting as a reason to pay attention to what we say about freedom, acts as a reason to reject it and listen to Mr. Torvalds instead. He deserves the credit for the kernel Linux that he developed, but the GNU Project deserves the credit for developing the GNU system. And therefore, I ask you to please call the combined system, when you talk about it, GNU plus Linux or GNU/Linux. Give us equal mention. I think we deserve that since we started it and we did the biggest part of it. But there's something more at stake here than credit. You see, it's not just the developers of GNU who don't get credit for what we have done. The ideals of freedom and social solidarity don't get credit for what they've done. And that's worse than unfair. That's dangerous. History shows us that we can never count on freedom to endure. Freedom is frequently threatened. And the only way to make sure you keep your freedom is to defend it. When people don't defend their freedom, you end up with something like the United States today, where our own leaders have taken away the most basic freedoms, such as the freedom not to be put in prison without a fair trial, and done so in the name of protecting us from secondary enemies, the big enemy being themselves. But in order to defend their freedom, people have to appreciate it and value it. And in order to value their freedom, first they have to know what it means. In other areas of life, people have been talking about the ideas of human rights for hundreds of years. That doesn't mean it's always easy to defend them. But at least we have something to start with, that lots of people know what they mean know what they are, and many people have learned to value them. But software is a new area of life. It's only 15 years ago that a lot of Americans started using computers. And when they started, computers were dominated by proprietary software. There was no free operating system they could use. And they took it for granted that software would be proprietary. There was never a real public debate about the freedoms that a computer user is entitled to. Well, I believe I've identified 4 of them. The 4 freedoms that define free software are 4 human rights that every software user is entitled to, and that should never be taken away. But most people have never heard this idea. Most users of the GNU plus Linux system have never heard this idea because they think it's Linux. And the only ideas they've heard are the ideas that normally go with the term, quote, open source, unquote. A term that was coined in 1998 and promulgated by the people in the community that didn't want to talk about freedom and community as ethical ideals. They wanted to hush that up. And their strategy for hushing that up was talk about open source associated with a different set of ideals, or I shouldn't even call them ideals, a different set of ideas, which cite only practical benefits as values. Practical benefits like powerful, reliable software. And never present this as an ethical issue. Never say that what they're not campaigning for is evil. They wouldn't use the term evil. They would only say that it's likely not to work as well. And they were quite successful in getting business to join them. And as a result, most of the users of the free operating system GNU a few years ago had never even heard the term free software, let alone the ideas that it stands for, which I told you today. And that's why my work today focuses on teaching people about these ideas. There are over 1 million contributors to free software now. The community doesn't need me as a programmer. It has plenty of programmers. It doesn't have so many free software activists. It doesn't have enough people talking about freedom. I used to urge people to join me in this, and some of them said, well, I think we should follow a 2-stage strategy. First, let's get people to use the free software, and then we can teach them about the ideals of freedom. The problem is they always use this as an excuse to work on stage 1 only. And in fact, there are lots of people working on stage 1, and much fewer working on stage 2, and the result is that lots of people get through stage 1, and nobody ever invites them to stage 2, and so they piled up, you know, tens of millions, maybe hundreds, have piled up in here, and by now, caring about freedom is a minority viewpoint in our community, and if they ever do see it, they think, oh, well, those are some lunatics and extremists, and I'm perfectly happy with open source some of the time. I'm comfortable. Why should I think about these ideas that rock the boat, which only a few extremists ever advocate anyway? So what we need most of all to assure that freedom triumphs is more of you standing firm and clearly for freedom. It's not enough just to develop free software to do all the jobs we want to do. Yes, we have to do that over time. But we don't need free programs to do everything tomorrow. We can just not do certain things. We can make small practical sacrifices. Making sacrifices for freedom is nothing new. Fortunately, the sacrifices we have to make in this area are not big ones. They're just inconveniences. We can do it. You don't have to be a hero to do it. But what we must do is teach people above all to value freedom. Suppose that magically we got free software to do every job today. Well, we could hand this out, and tomorrow every computer user could have freedom. But if they didn't appreciate their freedom, would they still have it in 5 years? Probably not. The fool and his freedom are soon parted. If those people are using free software but they don't appreciate it for the freedom it gives them, what's likely to happen? Somebody will develop an attractive proprietary program that does something that the existing free software doesn't do and offer it to them, and some of them will find it attractive and they'll want to use it. The developer will say, all you have to pay is $100 and your freedom to be a good member of your community. But he won't mention the last one. It'll be implicit. And the users won't think of it, and they'll give up their freedom. And so 5 years from now, we will have backslid. This is not just theoretical. It's happened already. In 1992, we had a free operating system that could be installed in a bare PC, and you could use it in freedom. Around 1995, the developers of some of these GNU/Linux distributions, but they call them Linux distributions, had a bright idea. They could add some non-free software and call it a bonus, and maybe they would get more users. So they did this. And then the other distribution developers looked at that and said, uh-oh, they've got an advantage. We're going to have to do it too. We're competing with them. And I said to these people, you know, what you're doing is not right. It's sending a message to the public that non-free software is okay. That's the exact opposite of what we have to teach them. And they said, well, we have to compete with those other distros. So I said to them, well, why not at least apologize for it? You could say, you know, we're really sorry that the program such and such, like often it was Netscape, is not free software. We hope you won't use it. We've included it because we know many of you wanted it, and other distributions do. But if you want to live in freedom, the way to do that is not install this program. At least they would have partly counteracted the message that they were implicitly sending through their actions. Not totally, because actions speak louder than words, but the words do something. But they didn't do it. They all said, look at this bonus we offer you. By the late 90s, you couldn't find a completely free GNU/Linux distribution in a store. You could find lots of GNU/Linux distributions, mostly labeled as Linux distributions, but none of them was entirely free software. And people asked me, where should I get a copy? And there was nothing I could tell them. I couldn't recommend a distro which included non-free software, because I can't ever recommend non-free software to anybody. It's against my conscience. So I had to say, I'm sorry, there is no place I can recommend that you get it. Well, now finally there are a few. For instance, there's the distribution GNU-Sense. And there's the distribution Ututo. And there's the distribution Lag. You can find a list in GNU.org if you follow the menu item for on the side for free GNU/Linux distros. But you've probably never heard of most of those, right? Well, that shows that our community backslid almost 100%, and now we've crept back a few percent. So I'm not just speculating when I say that if people don't learn to value freedom, we'll lose it, even in our own community. People will have freedom and they'll let it go. They'll let it slip through their fingers because they don't bother to hold on to it. If they don't recognize freedom as important. There is nothing more important to do to make a good society in the future than to teach people to appreciate freedom and and defend it. Maybe eventually we'll get back the freedoms that have been taken away in this country, and so many others. There has been a tendency to insert many kinds of non-free programs into the GNU/Linux system. One that you commonly find is drivers for particular hardware. Now, some hardware manufacturers won't tell us the specs of their hardware. It's rather hard to write a free program to do a job if you can't find out what the job is. Now, we're not telling them they've got to develop the free software for us. We just want them to tell us what the program has to do, what commands it has to give to the hardware to make the hardware do its job. And they won't tell us. Well, some of them won't, but many of them do. This problem occurs for certain hardware, not all. So what do we do about that? Well, Ubuntu's solution is they install non-free drivers without even telling you if they think you need it. We need to ask people to reverse engineer the non-free drivers and figure out what the free driver has to do and develop one. We also try to pressure those companies to cooperate with us, which is why we now have a hardware directory in fsf.org, which says which, for certain categories of products, it says which ones work with all free software and which don't. So that way we can start to put market pressure on those companies. But we are handicapped by the fact that most people in our community don't even recognize the issue. Most of them have listened to the open source ideas and not the free software ideas. So they don't see a reason why they should refuse to use non-free software. There are tens of millions of us, maybe 100 million. We would have a lot of market pressure if we were organized to use it. Another way in which our community is backslid is by using non-free programming platforms. For many years, the Java programming language has been a major problem. People would write their free programs in Java because they heard it was a platform-independent language. And then their programs would only run given Sun's non-free Java platform. So we started developing a free Java platform that could run the same programs in freedom. And we've been making a lot of progress, but now the problem is being solved because Sun has decided to liberate its Java platform. And so I hope that means this one problem will be gone. But the same kind of problem can occur with any kind of language, any sort of library, anything that programs are based on that is non-free. You have to watch carefully what facilities you're using to make sure that they exist in the free world if you don't want your program to be in a trap. But even worse, our community now has something that 20 years ago we didn't have. Enemies. Powerful, organized enemies trying to make it impossible for us to do certain things with free software. The U.S. actually has 2 laws that prohibit the development of various free programs. One of them is called the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, an unjust law that gave publishers the power to write their own copyright rules, which they should never have done. What this law says is that if the publishers implement digital restrictions management, that is to say, the functionality of refusing to function, then any information that enables people to get around the restrictions that the publishers chose to put on you is censored. The U.S. now practices censorship of software. and has exported this evil policy to many other countries through its pressure. For instance, in the US, one of the rights that you nominally still have is if you buy a DVD, you have a right to watch it. But the free software that you could use to watch it has been censored because of the DMCA. Well, this law only applies to a limited range of programs. Programs that you use to access certain works or certain websites. But nonetheless, that's an important area. A lot of people want to play DVDs on their computers. And if they can't easily find the free software to do so, because its distribution is only underground, they might go and use non-free software. They might go and use a non-free operating system to do it. But the other law that can prohibit free software can prohibit programs for any kind of job. And that's patent law. In the US, any kind of idea for implementation in software can be patented. And patents that prohibit the development or use of software are called software patents. They're not legally a different category. They're ordinary patents, but the idea that they restrict is an idea you can implement in software. That's what makes them software patents. And that's why they are a threat to every software developer, because if you develop a program and it turns out you've implemented one of these patented ideas, you can get sued. And your users can get sued too. Now, a large program combines lots of ideas. If you look at your word processor, you'll see it has hundreds of features. Each of those features is at least one idea. But in some cases, it's a combination of many ideas, or there are many ideas you could see in the feature. And each of those ideas you could see in the feature might be separately patented. So one feature might get you sued 10 times by 10 different companies. The end result is that your word processor is probably has thousands of ideas in it, and is probably covered by hundreds of patents. Which means if you develop one, there are hundreds of potential lawsuits you might face, or if you even use one. Although individual users are not likely to be sued, it wouldn't be worth the trouble of the patent holders, but companies that use them and distributors. If you are carrying a portable surveillance and tracking device, please switch it off. They've already tracked you here, they already know you're listening to me. And if they want to listen in, they don't have to do it sneakily, they'll be able to listen to the recording. Or they can come to the speeches. So, the result is that software patents make software development like a minefield, like crossing a minefield. Because with each design decision, probably nothing bad is going to happen to you. But there are so many design decisions you have to take in order to get the job done across the whole field, which means you're surely going to step on something along the way. This analogy, however, is not perfect, because once somebody steps on a landmine, it's not dangerous anymore. But a software patent can keep on exploding over and over again and destroy any number of software projects. Free software is especially in danger from this because most free software developers are volunteers and don't get any money. We've shown we can develop powerful, useful software without money, but we can't pay lots of money to a patent holder without money. So, as always, freedom in the future is uncertain. But we have the opportunity to fight for it now. And that's what we have to do, those of us who want to live in freedom. That's what the free software movement is all about. And I hope that you will join in and help. To close, I want to cover a few secondary topics. First of all, sometimes people wonder why free software developers develop free software. There are more than 1 million of them, and I can't speak for them all. I don't know what they all think, but I can tell you several motives I've seen. One is political idealism, which is an important motive for me, but not all of the free software developers actually care about this at all. Another is fun. Programming is tremendous fun. Not for everybody, but often for those who are really good programmers. And I suspect that every free software developer is having at least some fun doing it. Another motive is to be admired and appreciated. If you write a good free program, a lot of people will admire you. That feels good. Another motive is professional reputation. If you release a good free program, it'll be very easy for you to get jobs. You just have to say, look at what I wrote. And they say, oh, well, we know you're a good programmer. Assume you did a good job. Another motive is gratitude. If you've been using the community's free software for years and really appreciating it, then when you develop a program that's useful to others, this is your opportunity to pay forward what the community gave to you. Another motive is hatred for Microsoft. Now that's rather foolish. Not that Microsoft shouldn't be condemned, but you shouldn't focus your condemnation that narrowly. Microsoft is merely the biggest of many who have done this particular kind of evil. Microsoft has succeeded in subjugating more users than any other proprietary software developer, but that's not because the others didn't try. They just didn't succeed in subjugating as many people. They're no better. But it's a fact that many people especially hate Microsoft, and many people contribute to free software for that reason. And their contributions are real contributions, even if their motive is a bit shallow. Another shallow motive that a fair fraction of developers have is money. Most developers are volunteers, but a considerable fraction are actually paid to develop free software. They're paid by universities, by governments, by big companies, by small companies. It happens in a lot of ways. So this is a list of the motives I can remember. Somebody may have another motive. Another secondary topic is free software and employment. Sometimes people are afraid that if the world rejects proprietary software and switches to free software, that this will mean a collapse in IT sector employment. But there's nothing to fear. Let's look at the IT sector. Programming is a small fraction of that. Within programming, proprietary software development is a small fraction. Most paid software development is development of custom software for a particular user. And those jobs will not be affected if people reject the proprietary software. See, in a free software world, sometimes it makes sense just to wait for somebody else to make a certain improvement or develop a program you want. If what you want is general and lots of people want it, well, maybe it's likely someone will do it soon. But when you want something specialized that you need to carry out your particular business, waiting would be foolish. You'd have to wait millennia. So, obviously, if you want it done this year, you're going to have to pay somebody. And so, rejecting proprietary software would mean the loss of a small fraction of the IT sector employment. Most programming jobs would be the same as they are now. But that doesn't mean that the programming employment would go down. It might go up. You see, free software generates employment of a different kind. Employment in adapting and extending free software. It's a bit like the construction industry. When a business moves into some space, typically it rebuilds the space to suit what it wants to do. And I'm told there are more jobs in modifying existing buildings than in building new ones, at least in the US. So that can be a lot of employment. And that's not possible with proprietary software. With proprietary software, when a business considers using it, it has two choices, take it or leave it. With free software, it has many choices, many changes it could make if it wants to pay for them. And some of them do. So the result is free software employment. I'm not an economist. I won't try to predict whether free software will result in a small decrease or a small increase in IT sector employment. The important point is there's nothing to be scared of. Don't worry about it. A final secondary topic is free software and education. Schools must use exclusively free software. It's their responsibility. There are 4 reasons for this. The most superficial one is to save money. Even in the wealthiest countries, schools are limited by their budgets. They shouldn't be paying for permission to run user-subjugating software. But that's a superficial, shallow reason, and some proprietary software developers get rid of it by donating gratis copies to the schools. And that leads us to the second reason when we ask why they do that. Is it because they're idealistic and they want to promote education? No, I don't think so. They want to use the schools as a way to teach children to become users of their software with the hope that they'll graduate with a dependency on that software that will be hard to escape from. It's like giving the school gratis doses of an addictive drug. And the schools should refuse those doses of the addictive drug, and the school should refuse those doses of non-free software. The school's mission is to teach people to be strong, capable, independent, and to know how to live in a free society. Which means, when you teach them how to use computers, teach them to use free software. Because when they graduate from school, you can be sure that those same companies will not offer them any more gratis copies of these programs, nor will they offer gratis copies to their employers. They're trying to use the school to direct society down the path of increased permanent dependence, which is inconvenient enough to escape from that they hope people won't do it. Schools should teach only free software so that they're teaching the next generation to be free software users accustomed to living in freedom. But there's a deeper reason, which is for the sake of educating the best programmers, the natural-born programmers. At the age of 13 or so, they are fascinated by computers. They want to learn everything about the computer and the system. If they use a program, they want to know how it works. But when a student asks a teacher, how does this program do this? If the program is proprietary, the teacher can only respond, I'm sorry, I don't know, and there's no way you can find out because it's a secret. So education is not allowed. But if the program is free software, the teacher can say, I'll explain as much as I know, and then if you really want to learn everything, here's the source code. Read it, and you'll understand everything about the program. And that student will do so because he's fascinated. And the teacher can say, if you come across anything you don't understand, show it to me, and I'll figure it out and explain it to you. This is really important. You see, these natural-born programmers don't have to be taught to program. For them, it's obvious. But learning to write good code is another matter. The way you learn to write good code is by reading lots of code and writing lots of code. Free software gives the opportunity for this. Every time the student reading that code encounters something he can't easily understand, he learns something. That's the wrong way to do it. Don't do it that way. You have to learn a lot of those things in order to write clear code that other people can understand. I had an unusual opportunity to do this at the Artificial Intelligence Lab at MIT. We had a free software operating system mostly developed by the hackers of the lab and used by all the other people in the lab. And my job was to make it better, reading lots of code and writing lots of changes in real big programs that people really used. And thus, I learned to be a good operating system developer. Today, every school that uses free software can provide the same opportunity. But there's an even deeper reason. Because schools are supposed to teach not just facts, not just skills, but also good character, morals. Every class has to have a rule. Children, if you bring software to class, you may not keep it for yourself. You must share it with the rest of the class. However, the school has to set a good example. The school has to follow its own rule. And that means the school should bring only free software to class. This should start in kindergarten. And it should continue through the university. It should be the practice in this university and in others. Every university should move to free software, and if you're a student or if you work at a university, you should campaign for this. Your school should not be teaching permanent dependency on a powerful company that doesn't care about people's rights. Your school should be teaching exclusively free software. It can't get there overnight. It takes time to do a migration like that. That's understandable. You shouldn't demand that they change instantly. You should demand that they change step by step, steadily until they get all the way there. So, I will now end my speech by presenting my other identity. Some people have accused me of having a holier-than-thou attitude. I think they're mistaken, because when I meet someone who doesn't uphold the principles of free software, my goal is not to insult him. My goal is to convince him to do it. I take a constructive approach to that problem. However, I do have a holy attitude, because I'm a saint. It's my job to be holy. Saint Ignatius of the Church of Emacs. I bless your computer, my child. Emacs started out as a text editor, which became a way of life for many users because they could do all their work without ever exiting from Emacs. And ultimately, it became a religion with the creation of the news group alt.religion.emacs. Today in the Church of Emacs, we have a great schism between two rival versions, and we also have saints, but fortunately no gods. Instead of gods, we worship an editor. That's why I got this button, which you'll see later. Many users say that they love Emacs, so I got the button which says that Emacs loves every user. Now, to be a member of the Church of Emacs, you must recite the Confession of the Faith. You must say, there is no system but GNU, and Linux is one of its kernels. The Church of Emacs has certain advantages compared with some other churches I won't name. For instance, to be a saint in the Church of Emacs does not require celibacy. So if you've been searching for a church to be holy in, you might consider ours. However, it does require living a life of moral purity. You must exorcise any evil proprietary operating systems that have possessed any computers under your control, and install a wholly free operating system, where holy can be spelled in more than one way, and then only install free software on top of that. If you make this vow and you live by it, then you too will be a saint, and you may someday have a halo if you can find one, because they don't make them anymore. Sometimes people ask me whether it is a sin in the Church of Emacs to use the other editor, VI. It's true that VI is the editor of the beast. But using a free version of VI is not a sin, it's a penance. And sometimes people ask me whether my Halo is really an old computer disk. This is no computer disk, this is my Halo. But it was a computer disk in a previous existence. So thank you, and now I will answer questions for a while. This one seems to be warmer than my previous one, unfortunately, and harder to take off. I'm going to sit down now. I'm tired.
What are your insights into internet services that are approaching monopoly status, such as Google?
Well, I think those are a rather different issue. I see all of this in terms of the question of whether you control your computing. And web word processors and web spreadsheets, there you're doing computation that really is specifically yours, that you could do on your machine, but you're letting someone else have control over it. Now, the programs, this isn't because of something bad in the programs running on the server. They might even all be free software, and the problem is still the same. So you can't solve that by insisting that they release the software. It doesn't solve it. Now, one halfway measure that is better than nothing is to demand that they make it easy to export your data. Well, that gives you, in a global sense, partial control, meaning you have the ability to escape. But that isn't really control over what the program's going to do. So the only solution to that problem is don't use those things. Use a web server to do some job when it's a group's job. And you might want to insist that the group should control the software that's doing it, even if you personally don't. Obviously, we can't all have personal total control over every group we're in, right? We're not entitled to that. But you might say that the group should have total control over the software it's running.
If we're going to ask questions, I want you to use the microphone. We're doing an audio and a video recording, and that way, check it out later.
I'm very appreciative about your talk, speech, and for students, like we're always looking forward to look for a future career, like tries to pay back the education expenses that we need. And I would like to know whether you have a list of employer that they do the free software that we can
No, I
work with
don't.
them.
I know that there are many of them. 6 months ago, I was at a conference in France, and they said that free software companies in France employ 10,000 people. It's grown considerably since about 4 years ago when the figure was 1,400. But, you know, I don't know specifics. But there are a substantial number of free software jobs in programming, and of course there are many jobs involved in administering and setting up free software facilities. If you are determined to contribute to freedom and live in freedom, look around, and if you also show people that you're good, you'll probably find one eventually. The way to get into the free software community and get respect and get anything else is to contribute and do a good job. That's what shows people that they can admire you, that they can respect you, and that they want you working with them.
Can you comment on electronic voting?
I am scared of electronic voting. I think that elections are too important to decide how to do them based on a little bit of cost savings. I think voting should be done on paper. What we've seen is that it's too easy to steal elections through electronic voting. There is a lot of suspicion that several elections have been stolen in the U.S. that way, including the 2004 presidential election, which appears to have been stolen in Ohio.
You complain about software patents. What about more traditional patents?
Well, see, software patents restrict how each and every one of us can use our computers. So they're directly harmful to every citizen that uses computers. Whereas patents on how to build something like, say, car engines are just an economic matter among a small number of companies in a field I don't know. They don't directly restrict you and me, so we don't have to think about it. They don't pose the same kind of issue. And also, an automobile engine is never as complicated as a computer program unless it contains a computer program. The problem of every program infringes hundreds of patents won't occur in hardware. You know, a hardware design will will infringe several patents, but they're not likely to get up into the hundreds unless it's a mega project.
Richard, notable in the absence of your list of distributions of the new Linux that use totally free software is Red Hat. And don't they pride themselves on only offering free software?
No, they do not. Now, they may be moving there in Fedora. Red Hat's commercial GNU/Linux distribution includes a number of non-free programs, and they're not going to change that. Fedora is supposed to be entirely open source, but they may be moving to making it entirely free software as well.
A quick word on Fedora. Fedora started here, and that may be interesting to people who are from here. It started at the University of Hawaii, and I'm trying to remember the exact name, but started the project in Red Hat, took it over at some point. But my question is actually on hardware. All software runs on hardware, and I think it's possible to implement the restrictions that we worry about in software in hardware as well. So you could theoretically end up with a computer where all the software, all the way down to the BIOS, is free software, and yet you still run into companies that restrict their freedoms using their hardware. Is there a way around that?
Well, they do that. Although it's not that the restrictions are implemented in the hardware, that would be inefficient. The restrictions are implemented in the software, but the hardware stops you from changing the software. This practice is called TiVoization, because the TiVo is the first product I heard of which does it. The TiVo contains a small GNU/Linux system, and I believe they comply with GPL version 2. So if you ask for the source code, they'll give it to you, at least for the GPL covered programs. And so you could modify the source code, you could compile it, you can then install it in your TiVo, at which point it won't work. Because the TiVo checksums the program before it starts, and if it sees that you've changed anything, it will shut down. So in GPL version 3, we're going to prohibit TiVoization.
If one wanted to introduce free software thinking into a MIS education program, what are your thoughts on how one could start doing that, given sort of the already...
Well, first you have to find free software to use, to teach people to use, and then you could add a module about software and freedom. And that would be the case for any particular course.
I wanted to ask, have you given much thought the idea that software is really one aspect of our culture? Because when you talk about the assault perpetuated by the proprietary software developer on the individual user, that immediately to me makes me think of like how the big media companies assault individual people, like by making it illegal, for example, to like video your friends singing a popular song and post that on the internet. I see a direct analogy to what you're saying about software.
Yes. Well, basically, it's a symptom of the sickness of democracy. Democracy in the U.S. is so sick it can barely get out of bed. And in many areas, laws are paid for by businesses that stand to benefit from them, and that's certainly the case of copyright law. So with the DMCA, they took away all of our freedom for digital works, if they're encrypted, that is. And it's nasty. But it's a sign of the fact that they are a concentrated interest which tends to defeat a diffuse general public interest, even if it's bigger. Because the general public is not organized on this issue, and those businesses that make their money by restricting us are.
Were you encouraged by your meetings in India?
I'm afraid I can't hear you.
You went to India, right? And
Yes.
Were you encouraged by your meetings with them?
Was I encouraged by my meetings in India? Well, some of them, yes. There are now 3 states in India that are migrating their schools to free software. Kerala started a few years ago, and West Bengal announced it will follow, and Tripura also. So with 3 states migrating to free software, it will mean many millions of people that graduate from school as free software users. It's a big victory. Of course, it's when you look at the overall victory of the liberation of cyberspace, this is just one step, but it's an important step.
You mentioned that you took the technical route to promote free software.
I can't hear you.
Just speak loud.
You have to speak loud and clear. I am half deaf.
You mentioned that you took the technical route to promote free software. Do you see a point in time where the Free Software Foundation should move to the political arena to affect the laws?
Yes, we already have. Our biggest campaigns now are in the legal and political arena. We're developing version 3 of the GNU General Public License to deal with new ways of taking away our freedom. And we have 2 grassroots campaigns. One of them is defectivebydesign.org, which is a campaign of public protests against DRM. And we have badvista.org, which is designed to show people what an ugly vista is in front of them if they use that particular operating system.
Do you miss the days of hacking Emacs and NE43?
Yes, but I've been involuntarily self-promoted into management.
do any programming anymore?
I have very little time for programming, just a little bit. I would enjoy it if I could do more, but I'm getting old anyway.
You're hacking at a higher level.
I'm a political activist, which is, in some sense, among the highest callings for humanity.
I understand there's an open BIOS movement and or activity going on.
Well, I would prefer to call it free.
Free, I'm sorry.
Yes,
Stand corrected.
and I'm hoping that I will be able to use the one laptop per child machine because it runs a free BIOS.
Two things. One, I've also recently read about OpenSUSE making a completely OSS version of their
What?
operating
Sorry,
system.
who, what?
OpenSUSE is now distributing an OSS version of their operating system.
You mean a free software version? Is
Free
it
software version.
Because open source is not always necessarily free software.
Correct.
You know, if someone tells you something is open source, you don't actually know for certain that it's free software.
Also, what are these?
I don't know. I don't know that name. I don't know anything about them.
Okay. Also, what is your stance on the GPL3? I've heard a lot of discussion that it's a little more restrictive and people aren't.
Well, it's not more restrictive. It does more to defend our freedom. When I wrote version 1 of the GPL, I knew of 2 ways that people try to take away other users' freedom and make free programs proprietary. One way was to add license restrictions. The other way was not to let them have the source code of their version. So GPL version 1 says you can't do those things. In GPL version 2, I blocked another way that I had seen, a new way that I hadn't known about in 1989, but in 1991 I did know about it, and that was the attempt to use software patents to make somebody sign a patent license restricting the program. So GPL version 2 added section 7, which says if you sign something saying that you can't distribute it with all these freedoms, then you can't distribute it at all. Well, now we know of other ways to make a free program effectively proprietary. One of them is TiVoization, and the other is things like the Novell Microsoft deal. So we have put in requirements against TiVoization and against the Novell Microsoft deal. However, in most other ways, the changes actually give more permission.
Yeah.
I should say, the overall purpose of the GPL is to make sure that a free program remains free for all of its users. To make sure that the program remains free by the time it reaches you, we have to say that the middlemen are forbidden to take away the freedom before it gets to you. In effect, what the GPL says is forbidding is forbidden. That idea has not changed and will not change. But as they invent new ways of trying to forbid you the 4 essential freedoms, we need to block them.
I've personally been frustrated by restrictions on software in my work, but I deal with a lot of people who, when they see that, they take the opinion that, well, it's a bad system, but since it exists, we're better off taking advantage of it, and they feel that their obligation, to other people and to, the company and things like that, is to take any short-term advantage that they can get. When you're dealing with people who have that opinion, feel strongly that that's the way to go, what do you say?
I don't try to convince them. I just use them as examples. Those people are not inclined to listen. So what I do is I show how they are amoral people who don't care about others' rights. And I hope that someone else will be persuaded. Ultimately, I hope we will simply stop those people from taking away our freedom, whether they've been convinced or not.
Richard, I just wanted to clarify something in the various versions of the GPL.
This has to be the last one because we have to finish the 7. 2 hours.
Okay, I have a 4-part question. person who has received software under that version of the GPL to exercise, to distribute it and avail themselves of the freedoms
That's right.
of that version.
Yes, that's right.
Successor version.
No, that's not true.
That's not true.
Each program can specify either a particular version or a particular version or any later version.
Okay. And if it's, but could a program say that this is licensed under GPL version 2 only? And
Yes, it can, but I hope you won't. Because then, when others advance to GPL version 3, your program will be incompatible with them and we won't be able to copy code back and forth.
The question I have for you is, what's the progress on the kernel that you're moving to?
Not much.
Is it going to
Yeah, who
come out
knows?
well?
A few volunteers are working on it a little. But it's not the crucial thing. We have a free kernel. We just have to keep it free, which is not necessarily easy. For instance, many device drivers in Linux actually contain pieces of non-free software, which are firmware to be downloaded into the devices. And they are presented in what's supposedly a C source file as an array initializer, which is really just binary data. So in fact, that's not free software, and under the GPL, you can't redistribute it because there's no real source code for it.
Doesn't the kernel say painted module or something like that?
I don't think so. I think that there are also some people who distribute non-free device drivers.
I noticed in my log messages saying this is painted your kernel.
But those are two different things.
Right.
There are entire device drivers that are non-free for which there's no source at all.
Right.
And then there are device drivers that purport to be free, but in fact they contain something that only has the form of source code and really is not source code. It's really an initializer for an array of thousands of binary numbers. Anyway, at this point I've got to call questions to an end because we're supposed to end at 12:30 and I don't want to make things late. And so we better go back to giving away the stickers and selling gifts and shirts and so on.
Folks, right outside this door, we have a plethora of pizzas, those with cheese, those with vegetables, those with lots of meats, drinks, napkins spread out amongst different tables. Each table has been categorized with either a cheese or a meaty or a vegetarian one. So in some way we're bringing some things here shortly as in case you don't want to eat the pizza. Some are thin crust, some are thick crust. We will thank Bart and George, who's out there now. He's with Sun Microsystems, and it was very kind of them to do this. And very kind to Richard. And someone, while we have the opportunity, well, we've got a captive audience. Jim Thompson in the back is the gentleman who runs an amazing free and open source software-based wireless company here called Netgate. It was Jim's vision to bring Richard here. Jim's checkbook that brought him here, while I offered a spare bedroom. We're all very thankful to Jim. To Julian Yap, those of you who've seen it. Jim's on the board of PFOSSCON. Our young friend Julian Yap also on the board of PFOSSCON. Julian took care of all your registration, all the tracking of registration, putting the website together, and we're deeply grateful to Julian. Friend Dave Burns brought the table. Ron Fox, HOSA board member. Good to have Ron here. Joseph Diame, HOSA board member. Eat your food, but don't go away, because it's going to get just as good this afternoon. When we have our friends from Hayata. When we have our friends from, oh, here we are. Let us all thank Bart and George and Sun Microsystems. If you missed anything, don't worry. We're taping the event right now. We will stream this in a free and open codec. We're also doing an audio recording, thanks to our friend Daniel here, who's taking care of that. So if you missed anything, you want to see it again, Go to the wholesome.org website. We'll link you to everything that's happening today and everything that is yet to happen today. So let's all go outside, have a good time, eat some lunch. And,
Don't all go outside. Come here and support the FSF.
we got a lot to